You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the BioHealth Capital Region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis. I'm your host for BioTalk, where we interview leaders within the BioHealth Capital Region who are making a difference. And today we are really pleased to have a head of the U.S. R&D Center and the VP for Vaccines R&D for GlaxoSmithKline, and it's located in Rockville, Maryland. And we have Sally Mossman with us today. Hi, Sally.
Hi, Rich. Happy to join you today.
Well, thank you for joining us because we know that you're very busy, and just to take an hour out of your time to do this is probably taking an hour away from us getting a new vaccine for COVID-19, right? But I know that you will make up the difference here. So we really are pleased to have you. And I know that you're in a interesting role there with GSK right now, and with a rapidly growing group here within the Montgomery County area. So before we start talking about the company, I think the listeners would like to learn a little bit more about you. So if you don't mind, why don't you give us a little bit about your bio and how you ended up where you are today?
Happy to do that, Rich. Thanks for the interest. So yeah, as you may tell from my accent, I'm British born. Still have retained some of that accent after all these years. So I did my PhD at the University of Liverpool in virology, and then came to the US to do postdoctoral training. And I actually did a couple of postdocs primarily in HIV vaccine research. Then after that, I took a position with a biotech company called Corixa, and that was based in the Seattle area. And the area of focus for that company was vaccines R&D in infectious disease, as well as the oncology space, and also in vaccine platform technologies. And actually, one of the key technologies that company was working on is something called an adjuvant. And that's something that is a constituent within a vaccine that really is especially important for more recent vaccines, as it's an immunopotentiator. So then at the time at Corixa, we actually had a number of partnerships with GSK. And at a certain point in time, GSK decided that it would make sense to acquire the biotech company. And I was part of that acquisition, actually. And the reason GSK acquired Corixa was really to enable a stable supply of the adjuvant, which is a critical part of many very important vaccines at GSK.
Plus to get access to the great talent that they had, right?
Well, absolutely. So following that, I spent 10 years in Belgium, and Belgium is the headquarters for GSK vaccines. So uprooted the family, moved them there. We had a great experience, I have to say. It was really a lot of fun. And I had numerous positions there at the company, and the most recent one being heading up the early development programs. So then 4 years ago, when we initiated the idea of building an R&D center in Rockville, was really delighted, and the rest of the family too, to move to this area, move back to the US and be part of the leadership team, the kind of founding group establishing the Rockville site. And then the last part is, as of January this year, I've had the great pleasure and privilege to head up the site. So that's kind of in a nutshell the story.
Well, thanks for the background and congratulations on your progression with GSK, making a great contribution within the BioHealth Capital Region. And you also mentioned 4 years ago making a decision to set up the North American headquarters in Rockville. But I know it wasn't the only area that you looked at. So how was the decision made to ultimately make the decision to make the Rockville facility the North American headquarters for vaccines?
You're right. We had a number of options because we already actually had some footprint for certain activities in Pennsylvania. But in the end, I think it's clear that, well, first of all, maybe why US? So US is a major part of the strategy for GSK vaccines. It's not just a key market for us as a vaccines business, but also the idea of tapping into more innovation. So that was really important. And then why Rockville? So we wanted to be close to strategic partners of ours, and NIH, DARPA, BARDA, for example. Being close to those parties, being able to meet and discuss face-to-face was really important for us. In addition to that, being able to tap into the premier universities around this area, so University of Maryland system, Johns Hopkins, in terms of collaboration and partnership opportunities. And then I guess I would say the last part of the equation was really being able to tap into the talent pool in this area. So with such an active biotech, biohealth, pharmaceutical community in this area, it was really helpful to be able to tap into that talent pool and offer them positions with GSK as we were building a new site. When we built the initial population at the site, we were about a third was people coming in from already within GSK. A third came in from the Novartis vaccines business that we had just acquired. But then a third were local hires. So that was critical.
Congratulations on a good decision. Also, as the VP Vaccines R&D and the head of the U.S. R&D Center, there's a lot involved with that title and responsibility. Would you like to talk to the listeners a little bit about what your responsibilities are day to day?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So as a site head, I have certainly an R&D responsibility, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about the R&D that we're doing at the Rockville site. But then, of course, there's also the responsibilities of being a site head, which carries things like EHS, employee safety, managing the COVID response. How do we keep our people safe while still the essential workers coming in to do their lab work, things like that. So, I have to say that's been really fun to bring in that kind of component of my job on top of the R&D piece. So from an R&D perspective, then, we have some really critical priority programs that we're running out of Rockville. We have a focus on maternal immunization and developing an important RSV vaccine in that space, as well as an RSV pediatric vaccine. We're also running an RNA vaccine platform technology, and I'm sure you will have heard a lot about RNA vaccines during this current COVID response in terms of vaccine development, really the wave of the future. We have a strong capability in terms of structural biology at the site. We've also got a team working on early process development. We're about 400 employees. 80% of that's R&D. Like I said, it's preclinical, technical development. We've also got regulatory, clinical, epidemiology, quality, those types of functions, and then, of course, some support functions on site as well. We also have commercial teams who are leading some of the work on our shingles vaccine, as well as flu and meningitis. So the scope is broad, which makes it, I think, really quite compelling from a site perspective.
A lot of people know that you're one of the leaders in the vaccines in the world, but most people probably don't know that you are the leading vaccine manufacturer in the world, correct?
We are. We are currently the number one. I'm very proud to say that.
Well, congratulations on that. And basically, you also touched on COVID-19. And two things I'd like to ask about that. Number one, what has it done to your workflow at your facility in Rockville? And second of all, let's talk about the implications of partnerships and everything else you're doing directly with COVID-19 as GSK and others that you are collaborating on and the types of initiatives that you're involved in.
Yeah, so I think your first question was, how is the COVID situation impacting our ability to get our jobs done? So initially, of course, we had to do what everyone else did in the area, which is send all the office workers home and really minimize even the lab workers coming on site. So we had to kind of rotate teams coming in and out. I'm happy to say that now, because we've managed to kind of really set things up so that we can keep everybody safe, we've managed to sort of maximize our lab folks coming in and doing their job safely. And amazingly enough, we have really not missed any of our critical milestones from a lab perspective. So I think that's really down to the teams putting extra energy and focusing on the priorities, of course. That's always key. And then for our office workers, most of them are still working from home. We have the occasional person coming in who needs to utilize the space, but equally there in terms of delivering regulatory files, executing clinical studies from an operationals perspective. Because of the dedication and hard work of our employees, we've managed to keep most things on track. Now, I think one of the biggest challenges that I'm sure you'll find many other companies are facing is the conduct of clinical studies. So we had some studies put on hold because enrollment was challenging, because it wasn't safe to bring people in. And I think that is what it is, and rightly so. We've had to live with that. But even that is starting to ease back open again. And maybe one last thought to leave you with. I think an interesting effect of the current COVID situation, particularly mask wearing and social distancing, is that clinical studies looking at efficacy for circulating respiratory viruses like RSV, for example, are very much likely to be impacted because there'll be less circulation of respiratory viruses. So that's something that we've had to think about how we're going to mitigate that.
Well, thank you for that. I'm glad that you're almost back to full operation with your lab, but I would imagine some of your admin people and operational people are still working from home.
Yeah, we've asked them what's their interest in coming back on site with social distancing and with masks. Most of them are quite comfortable staying home and feel that that's the right thing for them to do. And we're certainly in no way obliging people to come back in. It just doesn't make sense.
Right. There is no sense rushing it, really.
Not at all.
To be honest with you, from a productivity standpoint, we're all working remotely at BioHealth Innovation, and we really haven't seen any degradation at all in our productivity. And as a matter of fact, we've had a little increase in some of the areas. So maybe that's because people work 24/7, 7 days a week, and you don't have a stop and a start anymore.
I was going to say people start at 7 and they end at 7, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. So, but anyway, we're going to continue to sort of follow what the recommendations are. And like most people, I think everybody's looking at 2021 sometime to get back to normal operations. So the second part of that question, which was a long one, really related to the COVID-19 and GSK's involvement directly as GSK, and then also some of the partnership that have been formed as a result of collaboration needs, trying to get a vaccine as well as manufacturing done as efficiently and as quickly as possible.
So as GSK, we thought hard at the beginning of this situation. What is the best thing we can do to contribute to the pandemic? And our decision was to leverage our already tried and true pandemic adjuvant technology. Now, this was an adjuvant that we had actually licensed as part of our pandemic influenza vaccine. And through that program, we had, first of all, demonstrated a significant safety database for the product, and also shown that in combination with the influenza vaccine, that it was a critical component for reducing antigen dose. And obviously, whenever you're looking at mass vaccination in a pandemic setting, the ability to make the antigen go further is really important. The other property of the adjuvant is that it enhances the potency as well as actually stimulating broader cross protection, which may be relevant in COVID as we see more genetic variation in the circulating virus. So that was our approach. And we've made a commitment to deliver 1 billion doses of the adjuvant by the end of 2021. Now, all of this, of course, on top of our usual business, which is manufacturing about 900 million doses of vaccine every year. So it required quite a bit of effort from our manufacturing colleagues. We've signed a deal with the US and the UK to provide adjuvant. And for the US, that means 100 million doses by the end of February next year. We're also talking to the EU and COVAX. And Rich, maybe just to say, so while the adjuvant isn't manufactured in Rockville, most of it's actually done in Pennsylvania, but the team leading the contract with BARDA is driven out of the Rockville site, you'll be pleased to hear.
Well, that's good. We know we can't control everything, but to be honest with you, if you look at Montgomery County right now, it's almost one of the epicenters for the pandemic and COVID-19 solutions, really, with the major BARDA involvement and the companies that are engaged. We probably have maybe 2 or 3 out of the 6 leaders right now that are in that race to get the vaccine to market.
And isn't that exciting, Rich? Because I think that injection of funding, that the pushing forward of the technological advances, I think it can only help this region and really help the growth and expansion.
Well, yeah, the other thing is that the light is shining on the region right now for people who didn't know how important we were to the global healthcare economy. I think they're starting to recognize it now with GSK and AZ and Emergent and Novavax and everybody else that's doing what they're doing, plus having accelerated FDA approvals, which is right down the street, and then having the collaboration with NIAID and BARDA and NIH and all of the researchers. So, I mean, we really have some of the critical assets necessary to fight this pandemic.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And maybe one last thing before we leave COVID. So you talked about collaborations.
We don't have to leave it right now.
I did want to say, because today is a very important day because, we have a collaboration with Sanofi Pasteur. And I think this is a wonderful example of 2 pharmaceutical companies joining forces, Sanofi bringing the antigen, GSK the adjuvant. And today, actually, we announced that we've started our first clinical study with that combination.
Oh, really? Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
If you can send me the release, we'll get that into our newsletter. That would be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. But one thing you said, and I'm going to pick up on it, is that 100 million doses by February of 2021. Did I hear that right?
Yes, that's right.
Well, that means you have to have actually a vaccine by that time to manufacture, right?
Our approach is collaboration, right? So we are collaborating with Sanofi on their antigen. We're also collaborating with a couple of other players, so Medicago, as well as a company called Clover in China. And both Medicago and Clover are in phase 3. They're entering phase 3 now. So the idea is to work with a number of different players with different approaches from an antigen point of view. And the expectation is at least one, if not more of them, will be successful. But you're right, the race is on. The race is on for sure.
And really, as someone from industry rather than someone from politics, I guess the question a lot of listeners, and I'm talking to Sally Mossman, who's VP Vaccines R&D, head of U.S. R&D Center in Rockville, Maryland for GSK. And I normally would close with this, but since we're still talking about COVID, there's a lot of theories and projections and philosophies about when we're going to actually have a vaccine. And since you guys are intimately involved in a number of the different aspects of it, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what's your realistic feeling about when we're going to have a vaccine through phase 3 clinical trials and will be readily available on a global basis?
I think that's a great point. And I'm, first of all, a strong believer in making sure we do the right studies and generate the right safety data before we launch vaccines. But I think the fact that so many companies have progressed to phase 3 already is really astounding. So I think by early 2021, we may actually have sufficient data to be able to authorize a vaccine. Now, then the question is, at what point will there be enough doses of a vaccine for mass vaccination campaigns? And I think this is where it's so important that we've got numerous players developing vaccines, because I don't think one will be able to provide enough doses. So that's one thing. I think we're increasing the probability of success in terms of implementation, but it's going to take time. I mean, it takes time to scale up manufacture, it takes time to distribute doses, it takes time to organize campaigns. So I think it's not going to be tomorrow. I think it's going to take through next year at least.
To really get the mass doses out there.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so the other thing that, and I don't want to put you on the spot again, but a lot of people talk about phase 3 clinical trials and they think, oh my goodness, we're already there already. But a lot of people don't understand how complicated doing a phase 3 clinical trial is and what the chance of success is of going through that phase 3. So if you don't mind, just to educate our listeners a little bit, since GSK has been involved in getting so many different vaccines through phase 3, just explain a little bit about what phase 3 really is involved in a phase 3 clinical trial for a vaccine.
So usually by the time you get to phase 3, you've done a small phase 1, which the primary question is safety. Then you've done a phase 2 program where you've looked at dose selection. And so by the time you're in phase 3, it's often thousands of subjects that you're immunizing. And you want to be asking the question around not just immune response, but also efficacy. And so to do that, you have to have enough subjects and the follow-up to establish whether or not the subjects who have been vaccinating are infected with the virus or not post-vaccination. So there's this whole program of vaccinating lots and lots of subjects, and then the whole follow-up piece, which is whenever they are, so tracing them for, are they symptomatic, are they not symptomatic? Once they're symptomatic, you have to test because you actually have to have a lab-confirmed infection or not. And then you've got cohorts who are vaccinated versus cohorts who are placebo vaccinated or control vaccine is delivered. And then you need to have the statistical comparison between those two cohorts of subjects. So there's a lot involved in terms of the operationalization of that big trial and all of the readouts and follow-up downstream. And of course, ensuring patient safety, making sure that you're following up from a pharmacovigilance standpoint as well. Because one of the big questions for COVID is, will vaccinees actually get worse once they encounter the virus if the vaccine is not appropriate?
And then the other thing is you have to get different demographics geographically as well as different ethnicities involved. Say you're doing 30 to 50,000 people, you're going to do different countries around the world and different ethnicities and the whole thing. So in a perfect world, and say I just entered phase 3 clinical trials today, in order to get through every step that you've demonstrated that needs to be done to get it ready and FDA approved and ready to go, what would be the fastest that could be accomplished?
In a COVID situation or in a pre-COVID situation?
In a pre-COVID versus a COVID.
Yeah. So a traditional phase 3 program could take, for example, 3 years. If you give an example of RSV, for example, you're immunizing large cohorts of subjects, you would want to follow them through an RSV season to establish efficacy and also safety. And then perhaps you want to establish persistence. So you might want at least 3 years of efficacy data before you file. And then very often it's a year between a file and a launch. So we're talking about 4 years, perhaps, in a more traditional program. Now, in this situation, we're not talking about a traditional program at all. And the circulation of the current virus is such that perhaps establishing efficacy will be much faster. FDA is likely to go for emergency use authorization, so they won't be requiring quite so many data sets as they would normally require, understanding that they will generate them post-authorization. So I think we're looking at much faster time frames, more in the months.
Yeah, it's not 3 years, it's X number of months, correct? Yeah, and it's hard to predict how many, but yet it's definitely on an accelerated pace for sure.
Yes, and I have to say FDA is doing amazing things to accelerate and to work with the manufacturers to make sure that, yes, things are done in a safe way, but that they are not being the gatekeepers in terms of timelines, etc.
Is there any advantage whatsoever of having the FDA down the road from you when you're going through regulatory approvals?
That's an interesting point because I think, yes, since maybe not for regulatory approvals, I should say no, because all of that, they follow their standard procedures. They certainly will not favor somebody who's down the road versus somebody who's not. On the other hand, I think we have had an opportunity to organize portfolio meetings with FDA where, we may be kind of educating around some of the developments that we're working on, sharing our thoughts for early developments. And I think that kind of scientific exchange is really beneficial to both parties, actually. But that's much more out of the usual kind of regulatory procedures.
Well, that's one of the things we try to sell to people. It's really probably more about the communication capabilities being local and easier to be able to set up some of those meetings in groups that you're talking about that need to convene. So we're glad you're close by, the FDA. Let's get off of COVID just for a second, because I know about shingles because I've been vaccinated for shingles. But let's talk a little bit about that because a lot of people don't think about it that much. But I've had an uncle who almost went blind with shingles. I have other people who have been really devastated with shingles. But I don't know if people understand the importance of the shingles vaccine right now. And maybe you might want to talk just a little bit about educating our listeners on shingles.
Yes, no, I'd love to. Shingles, the disease is really quite debilitating. So it's a reactivation of what was chickenpox earlier in life, but then it caused a very, very painful rash. And even after the rash is resolved, there can be neurologic damage, which can last years. Very, very severe pain. So really quite a debilitating disease. And it's particularly those who are particularly at risk are above 50 years old, and which is why the vaccine is indicated for 50 years and above. And I am in that club.
That's why I'm familiar with it because of that.
Indeed. So our vaccine actually contains one of the adjuvants that I talked about before in these immunopotentiators. And we really believe that it's that kind of secret sauce in the vaccine that has allowed us to establish more than 97% efficacy with that vaccine. So it's really, really extremely effective. And I'm happy to say that we're leading the development work out of the Rockville site. There's still some development work ongoing in terms of new countries, etc. So we licensed it in the US in 2017. And I have to say the uptake has been absolutely extraordinary. I think people really understand the value of prevention against a disease that can be as debilitating as shingles. So
I found out that it's very simple. I just go to my CVS and they've got the vaccine. They give you your injection and you're done. And I think you have to get 2, don't you?
You have to get 2. That's right.
2 doses. Yeah. So anyway, anybody out there listening, it's over 50 and you don't have your shingles vaccination, this is a good time to get one. And when you hear Dr. Fauci talk right now, he's encouraging people to get their flu shots because of the complications that could occur with COVID-19. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. It's always important to get flu shots because flu, the same as we're seeing with COVID, actually, older adults can be particularly badly impacted by flu infections. So we always encourage uptake of flu. But I agree that currently, I think with the respiratory implications of a COVID infection, I think that could be greatly exacerbated, or the damage caused by COVID could exacerbate a flu infection, for example. I think the other point is in terms of tracing the epidemiology of COVID, having flu underlying on the top will only complexify everything. So absolutely, if there's a prevention there, why not use it?
Yes, get your flu shots. We're done with the commercials for GSK right now. So let's talk a little bit about, in closing, as we're starting to wrap up, how do you feel about what we're calling the BioHealth Capital Region, which is Maryland, DC, and Virginia, where you're located? And we've had this goal. Genetic Engineering News does a biopharma cluster report every year to rank the top biopharma clusters. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we were number 6. And now we're number 4 because you have Boston, San Francisco, New York, and now what we call the BioHealth Capital Region. And we've sort of bypassed San Diego and Research Triangle based on their metrics, not in everything, but in their metrics. So our goal is to be number 3 by 2023. So we'd like to bypass New York. So how do you feel about this region and its vibrancy for what GSK does every day?
It's an important driver for us being here to start with. As I said, I think the COVID situation is really going to help further grow and develop this region. And we are absolutely thrilled to be part of it. So I think we would like to continue contributing to the growth of the region. We will continue to hire local talent. We want to be part of the local community. I think supporting organizations such as yours as much as you need us to support is something that we can do. Yeah, the location is of strategic importance to us. And we've also been doing more outreach with local universities in terms of talent development in academia, especially around some of the applied fields, and retaining talent in the area. So, and the partnership and community, the opportunities for collaboration between companies in the area, I think is something that we should not ignore either.
The stronger our cluster and our ecosystem is, the better it is for the companies that are here, because I hear a lot, you moved back from Belgium, and if something didn't work out with GSK and you like the region, you'd like to have an opportunity to potentially stay in the region with another company maybe. So, I mean, that's one of the things as our cluster grows, we can be able to attract and retain people, even if they might jump from one company to another, which is going on as we speak based on what's happening with COVID and the need for all these companies to keep adding employees. But yet I think that that's one of the strengths of the region, and one of the growing aspects of it is the ability to retain and attract, because it's not a one-trick pony. It's not just human genome sciences and MedImmune as it was when this region was getting started 20 years ago.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, there is that opportunity for individuals to move from company to company to grow their skill set. It benefits all of us. I totally agree.
So is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to have our listeners learn about GSK or yourself?
Maybe a few things. So I'd like to make a plug that we are hiring. We have open positions at GSK. So if any of your listeners are interested in being part of an established vaccines company, I really do encourage you to check us out.
And how would they check that out? Is there a website or an email address or something you'd refer them to?
Yeah, there's a website. So gsk.com.
gsk.com, and look for the Rockville operation, and Sally's ready to hire.
Absolutely.
And what was the other? Was there something else you mentioned? A couple things?
I did want to emphasize the strategic importance of the Rockville site to GSK as a company. I mentioned how the US is important from a market and an innovation perspective. The programs that we're running out of Rockville are critical priorities for the company as a whole. RSV, the RNA platform, the shingles vaccine. So I think you can be sure that the Rockville part of GSK is not going away anytime soon. I also wanted to say, from a personal perspective, my family and I moved here 4 years ago. It was our first time on the East Coast. We're really enjoying it, and we're really happy to have moved here to be part of this community. So yeah, it's a great place to live.
You're a great ambassador for the company and for the region. So thank you very much. And I'd just like to say that we're really excited about the growth you're experiencing and the important role you play within our healthcare delivery system. Keep up the good work, and we'd like to follow up with you. You mentioned you'd like to find ways to get more involved within the region and the community. We definitely have opportunities that we can talk about there. So we will make certain that we draw upon the expertise and the knowledge that you have where appropriate to get engaged in those initiatives that you can make a difference.
Sounds good, Rich. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, so we have been talking with Sally Mossman, who's the VP Vaccines R&D and the head of the U.S. R&D Center in Rockville, Maryland. Sally, thank you very much for being on BioTalk, and we'll love to catch up with you after we get this vaccine and pandemic nailed.
With pleasure.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.